This is Mr. Oscar, and today we will talk about something I want to approach with a great deal of care, because this topic is easy to get wrong. It is easy to turn into a lecture, easy to turn into the kind of content where an older man stands at a distance and points at a younger generation and lists everything they are doing wrong. That is not what this is. What this is an honest psychological examination of something I have been watching with genuine concern for several years now, or something I see in the young people I work with, mentor, and speak to, something that the research is now documenting with enough clarity that I think it deserves a direct, honest conversation. We are living in a moment where an entire generation, intelligent, informed, globally aware, more educated about mental health and self-understanding than any generation that came before them, is struggling to execute at a level that matches their own potential. Struggling to start things and finish them, struggling to sit with discomfort long enough to build something, struggling with the gap between knowing and doing in a way that is measurably different from what previous generations experienced at the same age. And I want to be clear before we go one step further. This is not their fault, not in the way that word usually implies. What is happening to this generation is happening to them, not because of who they are, but because of the psychological environment they were raised inside. An environment that no previous generation has ever had to navigate, and one that, if you understand the science behind it, explains almost everything. I want to tell you about a young man I was working with about 2 years ago. I will call him Daniel, 24 years old, brilliant, genuinely one of the sharpest minds I'd encountered in years. He had read widely, thought deeply, and could articulate his goals and his vision with a clarity that most people twice his age never develop. He had started 4 different projects in 18 months, a business, a creative endeavor, a fitness commitment, a skill he was trying to develop professionally. Every single one had collapsed before the 3-month mark. And when I sat with him and asked him to walk me through what happened each time, what the experience felt like from the inside, he described something that stopped me cold. He said, "It always starts well. I feel the excitement, the possibility, the momentum. And then somewhere around week 3 or 4, the excitement fades and what's left is just the hard, slow, unglamorous work. And I know I should keep going. But everything else, my phone, the content, the conversations, the options, everything else just feels more immediately alive than what I'm trying to build. And I keep choosing the alive feeling over the slow work, every single time." I did not hear a lazy young man when he said that. I heard someone whose nervous system had been precision engineered over years of exposure to a specific technological environment to find the slow, unglamorous work of execution almost neurologically intolerable. And the research explains exactly why. To understand what is happening psychologically to this generation, we need to go back to some foundational science and then trace it forward to the present moment. The first place to start is with Walter Mischel, the psychologist at Stanford University, whose famous marshmallow experiments in the late 1960s and 1970s studied delayed gratification in young children. Mischel offered children a choice: 1 marshmallow now or 2 marshmallows if they could wait 15 minutes. The children who were able to wait, who could tolerate the discomfort of delayed reward, went on to demonstrate significantly better life outcomes across multiple measures, including academic performance, professional success, and emotional regulation. What Mischel's research identified was that the capacity to delay gratification, to choose a larger, later reward over a smaller, immediate one, is one of the most powerful predictors of real-world execution we have ever found in behavioral science. And it is a capacity that is built through repeated exposure to situations where waiting is required and where the waited-for reward eventually arrives, through the accumulated experience of tolerating discomfort and being vindicated by the outcome. Now, here is the question that should sit uncomfortably alongside Mischel's findings. What happens to the capacity for delayed gratification when an entire generation grows up inside an environment specifically engineered to deliver immediate reward for almost every impulse? Dr. Jean Twenge, a psychologist at San Diego State University and one of the most rigorous researchers studying generational differences, has been tracking psychological shifts across American generations since the 1980s. Her research, compiled in her book iGen, documents a series of measurable behavioral and psychological changes that accelerate sharply around 2012, the year smartphone ownership among teenagers crossed the 50% threshold. Twenge found that after 2012, and in direct correlation with the rise of social media and smartphone dependency, measurable rates of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and what she identifies as a diminished tolerance for difficulty and discomfort rose sharply among adolescents. And critically, she found evidence of what researchers increasingly describe as an erosion of the psychological muscles required for sustained, unrewarded effort. The generation that grew up after 2012 did not simply have more access to distraction. They grew up inside a system that was actively, algorithmically, delivering dopamine hits at a frequency and intensity that no previous human nervous system had ever been exposed to during its formative developmental years. This is where the neuroscience becomes critically important, and where the work of Dr. Anna Lembke, a psychiatrist at Stanford University and author of Dopamine Nation, changes the entire frame. Lemke's research on dopamine and the pleasure-pain balance explains what is happening inside the brain of a generation raised on high-stimulation digital environments. Dopamine is the brain's primary motivation and reward chemical, but the brain is not designed to maintain elevated dopamine levels indefinitely. Every time dopamine spikes, through a social media scroll, a notification, a piece of engaging content, the brain compensates by tilting toward the pain side of the balance. It downregulates dopamine receptors. It reduces sensitivity to reward. The result is that over time, with repeated high-stimulation input, the brain requires increasingly intense stimulation to feel the same level of engagement. And critically, ordinary low-stimulation activities begin to feel almost unbearable. Not difficult, not uncomfortable. Genuinely neurologically flat, empty, unrewarding in a way that is not a matter of attitude or effort but of actual brain chemistry. This is what Daniel was describing when he said, "The slow work stopped feeling alive." He was not being dramatic. He was accurately reporting his neurological reality. Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist at New York University and author of The Anxious Generation, has spent years assembling the research evidence that links smartphone and social media exposure during adolescence to measurable changes in the brain's reward processing, attention regulation, and tolerance for sustained effort. His conclusion is unambiguous. We have conducted, without consent or awareness, a massive neurological experiment on an entire generation, and the results are showing up in their capacity to execute. But there is a second psychological force operating on this generation that is equally important and less often discussed. Erik Erikson, the developmental psychologist, whose work on identity formation across the lifespan remains foundational in modern psychology, identified adolescence and young adulthood as the critical period for what he called identity versus role confusion. This is the developmental stage where a young person builds a stable, coherent sense of who they are, the foundation from which consistent action, long-term commitment, and genuine execution become possible. Erikson argued that this identity formation requires something that our current digital environment has made increasingly difficult to access: silence, boredom, the unstructured experience of being alone with oneself without external stimulation. Because identity is not built through consumption, it is built through reflection, through sitting with uncertainty long enough that your own values, preferences, convictions, and sense of self can emerge from the noise. Previous generations, not through any virtue of their own but simply through circumstance, had enforced access to that silence. The boring Sunday afternoon, the long car journey with nothing but a window and your own thoughts, the evening with no screen and no stimulation where the mind was left to wander and in wandering, to know itself. This generation has been denied that silence at the precise developmental window where the self is being built. And the consequence, documented in Twenge's research, in Haidt's work, in the clinical observations of therapists working with young adults across the developed world, is a generation that is, in many cases, still searching for the stable identity from which consistent execution becomes possible. Because here is what I have come to understand deeply after everything I have studied and lived. You cannot execute consistently from an unclear identity. You cannot build disciplined behavior on an unstable sense of self. The action has to come from somewhere. It has to be rooted in something. And when the foundation of identity is uncertain, when a young person is still genuinely unsure at a neurological and psychological level of who they are and what they stand for, the execution will be inconsistent no matter how much they want it to be otherwise. This is not weakness, this is developmental architecture, and this generation is being asked to execute from a foundation that the environment they were raised in made uniquely difficult to build. There is one more layer I need to address, and it is perhaps the most structurally damaging of all. Martin Seligman, the psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania and founder of positive psychology, conducted landmark research on what he called learned helplessness, the psychological state that develops when a person repeatedly experiences outcomes that feel disconnected from their own effort and behavior. When the environment provides reward or punishment in ways that seem random, unpredictable, or unrelated to what the person actually does, the brain learns deeply and durably that effort does not reliably produce outcomes. And when that lesson is learned, motivation to attempt effortful behavior collapses. Social media, with its algorithmically arbitrary distribution of attention, validation, and visibility, runs almost precisely this dynamic. A post goes viral for no apparent reason. A carefully crafted piece of work receives almost no response. The connection between effort and reward is opaque, unpredictable, and frequently inverted. And a generation that has grown up measuring its value and impact through this system has been exposed, during formative years, to a near-perfect learned helplessness machine. The result is a generation that, in many cases, has developed a genuinely impaired sense of personal agency, a reduced belief that their effort reliably produces their outcomes. Without that belief, sustained execution becomes psychologically almost impossible. So here is the practical work, and I want to speak directly to the younger people watching this, because this is not a diagnosis. It is a map, and maps exist to show you the way out. The first step is what Lembke's research calls a dopamine fast, not permanent, not dramatic, a deliberate, structured period of reduced high-stimulation input that allows the brain's reward sensitivity to recalibrate. 30 days of significantly reduced social media and high-stimulation digital consumption. Not to punish yourself. To restore the neurological baseline that makes ordinary effort feel rewarding again. Lembke's clinical research shows that even 30 days of reduced stimulation produces measurable changes in the brain's dopamine sensitivity, changes that directly increase the capacity to find meaning and reward in sustained, unglamorous work. The second step draws from Erickson's framework. Build in deliberate silence, unstructured time with no input, no stimulation, no content, daily, even 10 minutes. Not meditation necessarily, just the unstructured experience of being alone with your own mind. This is not wasted time. According to Erickson's developmental model, it is some of the most important work a young person can do, because identity is built in the silence, not in the noise. The third step is to rebuild your sense of agency through the smallest possible demonstration of the effort-outcome connection. Choose one thing, one small, contained task, where you can directly experience that your effort produces a result. Not a life goal, a 20-minute task with a visible outcome. And when you complete it, register it, consciously. File it as evidence that your effort works. You are systematically reversing the learned helplessness that the environment has been building in you, one small proof point at a time. I want to close with this. Every generation inherits a set of psychological challenges from the world they are raised inside. My generation had its own. The generations before mine had theirs. No era produces human beings without cost, but I believe this generation is carrying something particularly heavy, not because they are weaker, not because they want it less, but because they were handed the most neurologically sophisticated distraction and validation system ever built. During the exact developmental years when the psychological foundations of execution are supposed to be laid. That is not their failure, that is a circumstance. And circumstances, unlike character, can be worked with consciously once you understand them. The capacity to execute is not gone in this generation. It is suppressed, buried under layers of neurological conditioning that can be identified, named, and systematically reversed. You know more about yourself than any generation that came before you. You have more access to psychological understanding, to research, to frameworks for self-awareness than my generation could have dreamed of at your age. Now it is time to take everything you know and build the system that turns it into what you do. That is the work, and it starts today. I'm Mr. Oscar. This is Execution Psychology, and I will see you in the next one.